Hey YouTube, Marina's Tao here. Finally back really with the second tips and tricks series of Sins of the Solar Empire. And I wanted to speak about quite an important aspect or interesting aspect in Sins that never really gets mentioned in game. Namely, all ships have a listed weapon and armor type in the files for Sins. And no, I'm not talking like lasers or torpedoes or missiles. No, each ship armor and weapons are characterized from very light to over heavy composite to module type armor. And so what does this do? Well, when let's say two ships are fighting each other, an attacking ship, their weapon and module types get compared. And depending on the attacker's weapon type and the armor type, the damage dealt to the attacked ship is either buffed or nerfed. And why is this interesting? Well, it allows you to make quite an intricate system of counters inside Sins, where one ship is very good fighting certain classes, but would really suck fighting others, put it simpler. And there are quite a few numbers now, but I'm gonna put a link in the description to where you can find charts on the Sins forums that pretty much I don't know, you can print and have them at your side, or just pull just to look at for yourself to see what there really is. And so I'm just gonna kind of start at the top. Well, we'll start with the weapon types. Anti-very light. Anti-very lights are actually only flak frigates, and they're good versus ships with very light armor, which are only fighters. No other ship has very light armor. What does this do? Well, they deal 133% of their listed damage versus fighters. But on the downside, anything heavier gets less than their listed damage. Lights get 75% of their listed damage. Anything heavier than that gets 50% of their listed damage. And modules, so stations and stuff, only get 35% of their listed damage. So if you're fighting stations with flak frigates, you're going to take over double the time to kill them than you would if you say you were using anti-module weapons, which would go even faster. So, next class, well, makes sense, from anti-very light is anti-light, which are actually only fighters, colony ships, and scout ships. They do their full damage versus very light craft, but they deal double their damage versus light craft. So you can imagine, scouts versus scouts go very quickly because they just deal double their damage. But versus things with heavier armor, they deal only half their listed damage, and versus modules they have the same thing, they only deal 35% of their damage. Next from anti-light is anti-medium, which are long-range frigates, and also to mention the pirate anti-module ships and the pirate siege ships. And they do their full damage versus very light and light, and deal 133% their damage versus medium, and deal 75% of their damage to anything heavier, and 50% of their damage to versus modules. So already here the nerfs are not as bad as with lighter weapon types, but they're still there. Next are ships with anti-heavy weapons, which would be siege frigates, assault frigates, which are also known as light frigates, the pirate scouts, utility cruisers, like the repair ships and stuff, and the Vasari starbase also has some anti-heavy weapons. The Vasari starbase is always the weird egg in the bunch, always has different things. And so they have full damage versus very light and medium, but weirdly only deal 75% their damage versus lights, and deal 150% their damage versus heavies. Anything else not listed only gets roughly 50%. Some get a bit above and lower. I think Titans get a bit higher nerfed there. Next is anti-very heavy, which only bombers have, and they deal their full damage versus very heavy. They deal full damage versus very heavies. Deal only roughly 50% their damage to all other classes, and deal 65% versus modules. Now we come to a very interesting class, namely composite class weapons, and these are kind of like the all-rounders. Who have them? Well, heavy cruisers, which make them very useful. You know, you can pretty much use your heavy cruiser against everything. Pirate heavies and also strike craft, I think, have or had comp-site. It might have been changed in the last patch. So why is comp-site so good? Well, they deal full damage versus very light heavies, and very heavies deal 150% their damage versus lights, 125% their damage versus mediums, 120% versus pirates, 75% their damage versus capital ships and titans, and 75% versus modules. So pretty much fighting any type of put in quotation normal ship, heavy cruisers get buff damage, which is I wouldn't complain about it. Capital ships sadly are not as good. As you can imagine, capital ships have capital class weapons, and as well as the star bases, all three of them, and they only deal 25% their damage versus very lights, 75% their damage versus lights, full damage versus mediums, heavies, very heavies, and capital ships, 90% versus pirates and titans, and 75% versus modules. So, not as cool as comp-site, but they deal decent. They're not as punished as other ship classes versus other classes. There's another type which doesn't affect that many, but it's capital ability class weapons, and they do full damage versus everything except versus capital ships and titans, and they deal 200% their damage versus modules or stations, which is useful. Titan class weapons only titans have, which makes sense, but they deal 25% their damage versus very light, 75 versus light, full damage versus medium, heavy, very heavy, capital, and titan, 90% versus pirates, and 75% versus modules. In essence, we have the same kind of buffs, nerfs, like capital ship class weapons, only that they do not get that 10% nerf versus titans. Lastly, there's anti-module weapons. As you can imagine, those are the anti-module cruisers. And the Vasari Starbase also has anti-module weapons. They deal 25% versus very light and light, 50% to medium, 75% to heavy, full damage versus heavy, very heavy, capital, and titans, and 200% versus modules. So, interesting enough, they're quite useful versus very heavies, capitals, and titans. You can keep them alive and they would target them. And so to flip it around, just a quick list of what ship have what armor types. All very light, like I mentioned earlier, just fighters and mine squadrons. Light ships we have a lot. Colonies, frigates, scout frigates, long range frigates, siege frigates, bombers have light armor. Anti-module cruisers have light armor, envoys, refinery ships, constructors, and trade ships. Only ship with medium armor are the assault or light frigates. Heavy armor are flak frigates, utility cruisers, mine layers, carriers, and the starbase constructors. Only ship with very heavy armor are heavy cruisers. Only ship with pirate army are surprise, pirate ships. Capital ships have capital class armor, titans have titan class armor, and the big surprise, and all stations, mines, and star bases have module class armor. And so I know that was a lot and quite fast, so I made like this quick list of just pretty much the best counter to each ship class to have like a quick reference list, and just it's not that hard either. Best counter versus frigate fighters are flak frigates. Best counters versus scouts, colony ships, siege ships, long-range ships, and bombers are fighters, scouts, and if you're feeling very funny, you could make a fleet of colony frigates, theoretically. They'd also get buffs versus those ships. The best counter versus the assault light frigates are long-range frigates, exclusively. Versus flak frigates, carriers, and utility cruisers, you're best off using the assault or light frigates, siege and utility cruisers, and theoretically the Vasari Starbase, which also has anti-heavy armor weapons. Here comes the heavy cruisers, and that's what's interesting. Not only do they have the comp site class weapons, but no one there is no hard counter versus heavy cruisers. No one gets a buff fighting them, so you're pretty much best off using other heavy cruisers, capital ships, titans, or star bases versus heavy cruisers. At least you won't get any nerfs fighting them. Fighting titans, you're best off just using anti-module titan class weapons. Fighting pirates, you're best off just fighting using heavy cruisers. That's where you won't get, I believe you won't get that. Yeah, you get, sorry, my bad. You do get the buff fighting titans using the comsci class weapons of heavy cruisers. And I forgot capital ships. Capital ships is the same, either capital ships or anti-module ships. And that pretty much pulls it all together. I'll be sure to list the link where you can see all these charts and have all the numbers for yourselves to have a look on that again. Please like and subscribe, and if I don't get around to posting the next video, just start complaining again and I should get to it. Well, wish you all the best, happy hunting at Sins, and see you around.